She stood against the wall of a Beacon Hill mansion holding a silver tray while the woman about to marry Boston's most feared man mocked her in front of 50 guests. $10,000 waved overhead like a prize, a dance she never agreed to. And when the front door finally opened, no one in that room was ready for who walked through it, or for what she'd been hiding for 8 years.
Before we go further, if stories about quiet strength, buried pasts, and karma walking through the front door speak to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now. This one has a turn you won't see coming. Let's begin. In a city that guards its money as carefully as its secrets, few names carried more weight than Benjamin Warren's. Behind the gates of his home at 10 Louisburg Square, he was spoken of in careful, lowered voices. A man who had built his empire out of precision and fear, and who was rarely home long enough for anyone to claim they truly knew him. But this story isn't about him. Not yet. It's about a woman he had spent 8 years searching for without ever learning her name. A woman standing quietly against the far wall of his own ballroom tonight, in a uniform pressed and correct, about to become the last thing anyone in that room expected. The champagne flutes rang like tiny bells inside the marble foyer of 10 Louisburg Square, and none of the 50 guests laughing under the crystal chandeliers noticed the woman standing perfectly still against the far wall, holding a silver tray she would remember for the rest of her life. Hazel Caldwell was 27 years old, and she had learned over many quiet years exactly how to disappear inside a room full of people who paid her to be invisible. Her black uniform was pressed and correct. Her chestnut hair was pinned into a low knot. She kept her eyes down, the way she always did at these parties in Beacon Hill, because looking up only invited trouble. Tonight, trouble found her anyway. Catherine Phillips stood in the center of the room in a white gown that clung to her slender frame, a glass of champagne raised high, platinum hair catching the light like something designed rather than grown. She had been engaged for 8 months to the most feared Mafia boss in Boston, and in that time she had learned exactly how much power his name carried in this city, and exactly how much fun it was to spend it. $10,000, Catherine announced, pulling a thick roll of cash from her Hermes clutch and waving it over her head like a trophy. Cash, right now. Who's brave enough to give us a little entertainment on the dance floor? The room laughed, the easy, hungry laugh of people who sense a show is coming. Then Catherine's pale blue eyes found their target. "The Maid," she said, loud enough for every corner of the room to hear. "Or is she worried her body will embarrass her?" For half a second, the room went silent. Then it erupted into laughter, sharp and careless, the kind that spreads through a crowd like a spilled drink no one bothers to clean up. Phones rose into the air. In the corner, a 25-year-old influencer named Megan Turner had already tapped her screen to go live, grinning as if she'd just been handed a gift. Hazel's fingers tightened around the edges of the tray until her knuckles went white. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. But something about tonight, the way 50 strangers turned to watch her, the way people watch an accident, sent her mind rushing backward to a studio apartment in Jamaica Plain, where she used to eat cold noodles alone at midnight after double shifts, to a dance scholarship she'd walked away from without a single regret because her mother needed her more than any stage ever could, to the year her mother finally stopped breathing, and no one called to check if Hazel was still standing. No family, no birthday calls, just this. A room of strangers waiting to see if a maid would embarrass them all. In the far corner, a man in a dark suit kept his phone raised, filming everything with no expression at all. His name was Connor Hayes, and he was not filming for entertainment. As the household's underboss, Connor quietly audited the family's private accounts, and a few weeks earlier, he'd noticed money moving out of a discretionary fund that no one had authorized.
That was what led him to start listening. 2 nights after he noticed the withdrawals, sitting in his car outside a coffee shop, he'd caught the tail end of a call. Catherine's voice, low and businesslike, talking about a housekeeping problem that needed to disappear before the wedding. He had said nothing to anyone. He had simply kept listening.
Hazel set the tray down slowly, deliberately, the way a person sets down something they no longer need. She lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even her.
"I accept."
In that half-second before she spoke, Hazel wasn't choosing pride over shame. She was choosing the one thing left that no one could take from her. Years of swallowing insults had taught her that fighting back with anger only fed people like Catherine. But dignity, she'd learned, could not be mocked into surrender if she simply refused to flinch. Underneath her calm was a woman terrified of being erased again, the way she'd been erased after her mother's death. And terrified, too, of what might happen if the one part of herself she'd buried for 8 years finally stepped into the light. The room buzzed with delighted disbelief. Catherine's smile widened into something triumphant, already certain of the humiliation to come. Megan zoomed her camera in tight on Hazel's face, hunting for the flinch, the tears, the moment that would make this clip unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. She never got it. What the room didn't know, what none of the 50 people sipping champagne under those crystal lights could possibly have guessed, was that the woman they had just turned into a punchline was carrying a piece of her own past dangerous enough to shake a criminal empire to its foundation. And in less than an hour, the Mafia boss who owned this house would walk through the door and recognize her. Hazel walked to the center of the empty floor. Somewhere behind her, a string quartet began to play the opening notes of a waltz, the very song Catherine had hand-picked because she assumed it would make a heavy-set maid look clumsy in front of everyone who mattered. She had no idea what she'd just started. The waltz drifted through the marble room, delicate and formal, exactly the kind of music Catherine had chosen to embarrass someone she assumed had never taken a real lesson in her life. Hazel reached back and untied her apron, folding it once before laying it over the nearest chair. Her movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial. Nothing like the panic Catherine had been hoping for. As she reached for her collar, her fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the fabric. A thin necklace she never took off. Inside the pendant was a scrap of paper, yellowed with age, bearing a phone number a wounded stranger had once whispered to her on a rain-soaked street corner before he vanished into the dark. She had carried that number for 8 years. She had never once dialed it, because she had spent those same 8 years certain the man who gave it to her was dead. What almost no one alive knew was that the number wasn't the only thing she'd kept from that night. At 19, with a bleeding stranger's arm slung over her shoulder, she'd had the presence of mind to press record on her phone before pulling him through the back door, capturing 2 men's voices arguing in the alley behind her. The next morning, still shaking, she'd copied the file onto a flash drive and locked it inside a safety deposit box in Cambridge. She had never told a living soul it existed. She stepped onto the open floor. Crystal light spilled over her shoulders. A few guests were already smirking, waiting for her to stumble. She did not dance the waltz. Instead, Hazel let the music bend into something else entirely, a contemporary movement built from control and raw feeling. Sharp turns and grounded, powerful lines. There was nothing small about the way she moved, and nothing meant to please the crowd that had put her here. The laughter in the room began to die out, guest by guest. Megan Turner's mouth fell open mid-sentence, her running commentary trailing into silence. In a shadowed corner, a man in a dark suit, a soldier Providence had quietly planted at the party, watched the sharp rotation of her shoulder and felt something cold settle in his chest. Providence had kept grainy bar footage from a shooting 8 years earlier for exactly this reason,
to recognize the one witness who got away. He lowered his phone beneath the table and typed 4 words to someone waiting on the other end. The girl from Hanover Street is alive. She's at the Warren house. Sweat gathered along Hazel's collarbone. Her shirt slipped just enough to reveal a faint, long scar there. A scar from a night 8 years old that she had never explained to anyone. Connor Hayes noticed it. His eyes narrowed for only a second. Catherine, sensing the room turning against her, clapped too loudly, forcing brightness into her voice. "Keep going! The money's still here!" Hazel didn't look at her once. She kept moving as if she were finally releasing something that had been locked inside her body for far too long. For a moment, the marble room fell away entirely, and she was 19 again, dragging a bleeding young man into a back room off Hanover Street in the pouring rain, then walking back out to dance wildly on a crowded floor, not for joy, but to drown out the sound of gunfire outside with noise and laughter. The contrast was impossible to look away from a body the room had mocked minutes earlier, now commanding it completely, while across the floor, a stranger's thumbs moved silently over a phone screen, sealing her fate without her knowledge. The dance was building toward its final turn when the heavy front door on Mount Vernon Street was suddenly thrown open from the outside. Whoever had just walked in was about to witness far more than a scandalous dance. He was about to recognize the woman he had spent 8 years searching for, standing in the middle of his own home, turned into a spectacle for other people's entertainment. Catherine humiliated her for money. Hazel just silenced the whole room without saying a word. Whose side are you on right now, Team Hazel or Team Catherine? Drop a 1 for Hazel, a 2 for Catherine in the comments before you keep watching. Benjamin Warren stepped through the door, still carrying the faint smell of smoke from a late meeting in South Boston, and stopped as if he'd walked into a wall. He was 34, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in a crisp white shirt beneath an open black coat, and every person in that room understood exactly what kind of power stood at the entrance. This was the Mafia boss who ran half the underworld east of the Charles River, a man 5 minutes late, guests learned, never to interrupt. The string quartet, still holding the last note of the waltz, let it die out raggedly, as if even the musicians had felt the temperature in the room drop. Somewhere near the bar, a champagne glass tipped and rolled without anyone catching it, and no one moved to pick it up. But right now, that power was frozen, his gray-blue eyes locked on the woman finishing her final turn in the middle of the floor. The room went utterly silent. Catherine's face drained of color. "Hazel?" Benjamin said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. It wasn't only recognition. It was 8 years, finally closing a wound that had never healed right. That night on Hanover Street, he'd been bleeding out fast, fading in and out of consciousness, unable to hold on to more than fragments. Rain, her hands, her voice, telling him to stay awake. The men who dragged him out of there had moved fast, and by the time he came around in a car 3 blocks away, she was gone, and he never learned her name. All he had was a photograph, not even his own. One of the men who'd helped carry him out had snapped it through a window before they left, catching a young woman dancing under bar lights to cover the sound of what had just happened. Benjamin had kept that photograph in a locked drawer in his office for 8 years, with 2 words written beneath it: "Find her." He'd paid investigators across New England to chase a face he barely remembered. He had built the rest of his life on top of that failure without ever admitting it was a failure. His father had taught him that a man who ran an empire couldn't afford unfinished business, that loose threads were how families like his ended up in the ground instead of on top of it. Benjamin had absorbed that lesson everywhere except here. Every account was reconciled, every rival accounted for, every threat neutralized within a season. Except for one debt he could never close, one name he didn't have, one face fading a little more each year in his memory, no matter how hard he tried to hold on to it. He had told himself it was gratitude. Standing in his own foyer now, watching her chest still rising and falling from the dance, he understood it had never only been gratitude. That face was standing in his living room in a maid's uniform. For a moment, neither of them moved. The chandeliers hummed faintly overhead, the only sound left in a room that had been roaring with laughter minutes earlier. Hazel's breath caught somewhere between relief and disbelief, and beneath Benjamin's coat, still folded over the chair, her hands had gone cold. She had spent 8 years believing she'd buried a stranger's ghost along with her mother, another name she wasn't allowed to grieve out loud because grief, like everything else in her life, had never been given room. Now the ghost had a name, and the name was standing 10 feet away from her, alive, and looking at her like she was the only person in the room. What gripped Benjamin in that instant wasn't simple gratitude. A mafia boss who had built his entire life around control had spent 8 years unable to control the one thing that mattered most to him, finding the woman who saved him. His obsession with the search was never really about repaying a debt. It was about proving to himself that the one night he'd been powerless hadn't been erased, that someone out there still remembered him as a person and not an empire. Seeing her humiliated in his own house didn't just make him angry. It forced him to confront how completely he'd failed to protect the one person who once protected him. Catherine forced a brittle laugh, stepping toward him, her heels clicking too loudly against the marble in a room gone otherwise silent. "Darling, it was only a bit of fun." Benjamin turned to her, and his voice dropped to something colder than steel, pitched just loud enough for the room to hear. "Your idea of fun is forcing the woman who once saved my life to dance for money in front of 50 strangers." Catherine's mouth opened and closed once, no sound coming out, her rings catching the light as her hand tightened uselessly around her empty champagne flute. Without another word, Benjamin shrugged off his coat and draped it over Hazel's shoulders. A public, deliberate act of protection, done in front of every guest in the house. The wool still held the warmth of him, and the faint smell of cedar and gun oil that clung to everything he wore. Hazel's fingers found the lapel and held on more to steady herself than to keep it in place. Across the room, the Providence soldier's expression darkened, and he began quietly backing toward a side exit, his phone slipping back into his jacket pocket, without another word typed. Hazel stood still, breath still uneven from the dance, meeting Benjamin's eyes for the first time in 8 years. Neither of them said anything else. There wasn't a version of this moment that needed more words. Connor Hayes crossed the room slowly, his phone already lit in his hand, his expression unreadable. He'd been quiet all night, in a way that in hindsight hadn't been about watching Hazel at all. His eyes had spent most of the evening flicking toward the study door, toward Catherine's clutch, toward a woman who laughed a half-second too late at her own joke. "There's something you need to see," Connor said quietly, stopping half a step behind Benjamin. Benjamin didn't reach for it yet. His eyes stayed on Hazel for one more second, as if memorizing that she was real, before he finally turned toward his oldest friend and the small, glowing screen he was holding out like a loaded weapon. Whatever was on that phone, Connor's face made it clear it wasn't going to be a small thing. And the guests, still frozen around that marble floor, were about to learn that the night's real danger hadn't arrived with the Mafia boss at all. It had been sitting quietly in his underboss's pocket the entire time. Connor turned the phone so Benjamin could see the screen and set it flat on the console table so the message thread stayed lit for anyone brave enough to look. The blue glow lit both their faces from below, and for a second, The only sound in the room was the faint electronic hum of the screen itself.
It wasn't just tonight's humiliation. Weeks of watching the discretionary accounts had led Connor to a wire transfer, $50,000 moved out of the household's private funds into an account in Providence. Paired with it was a string of encrypted texts Connor had pulled after the call he'd overheard Catherine spelling out in her own words what the money was for. She hadn't been trying to silence a witness to a shooting she knew nothing about. She'd been covering her tracks after skimming from the family accounts to pay off a private debt, certain that Hazel, who dusted the study and sorted the mail, had seen enough paperwork to ruin her before the wedding even happened. The debt itself was smaller than the wedding it was meant to fund. A gambling arrangement from her father's failing textile business back in Providence, one Catherine had quietly inherited, along with the family name she'd worked so hard to trade up from. She had married up once already, in spirit if not yet in law, and she had no intention of ever being poor again. That fear, more than any love for Benjamin, was what had put $10,000 in her hand tonight, and a maid's name on a wire transfer 3 weeks ago. This was no longer jealousy. This was a plan to make a problem disappear, dressed up as house cleaning. The room drew a collective breath. Even Megan Turner's phone, still raised, went quiet for the first time all night, her thumb hovering uselessly over the screen, as if she'd forgotten what she was filming for. Benjamin closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to breathe once, slow and controlled, the way he did before any decision he couldn't take back. When he opened them again, whatever softness had been there for Hazel was gone, replaced by something flat and final. He looked up from the screen at Catherine, and though his voice never rose, it stopped every conversation in the house. This engagement is over. As of this moment, you are nothing to me. 2 security men stepped through the side door and took position on either side of her, close enough that she could feel the weight of their presence without either of them touching her. Catherine's calm in that moment wasn't composure, it was calculation, the last tool she had left. Her entire identity had been built on being the one who controlled a room, and losing Benjamin's name meant losing the only thing that had ever made her feel safe from being ordinary. Deep down, she wasn't fighting to keep him. She was fighting the terror of becoming irrelevant. And in that terror, she reached for the one weapon that could still make everyone look at her instead of Hazel. Catherine didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at Benjamin the way a woman looks at a hand of cards she's about to lose, and then she played her last one anyway. Calm and deliberate, the same way she'd played every card all night. She knows where the bodies are buried from that night, Catherine said, loud enough to carry to the back of the room. You think getting rid of me ends this? The words landed like a second explosion. Guests turned toward Hazel with expressions caught somewhere between fear and fascination. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered something to her husband and was quickly hushed. Benjamin's hand closed gently around Hazel's wrist, steady and certain, even as his gaze flicked past her shoulder to the tall windows facing Mount Vernon Street, where 2 black sedans without plates had rolled to a stop at the corner. Engines running, headlights dark. Security walked Catherine toward the door. Her 8-carat ring caught on the door frame and slipped from her finger, left behind on the marble like something no longer worth carrying. Later, when Connor traced the Providence account she'd wired the money into, he'd find something Catherine never knew: the shell company on the other end didn't just handle favors for jealous fiancés. It handled payroll for the very organization already hunting the woman she'd tried to have quietly erased. Her cruelty, aimed at protecting her own secret, had just handed her enemies a second reason to come looking. The front door closed with a heavy, final sound. For several seconds after it shut, no one in the room spoke. Someone finally set down a champagne glass too carefully,
as if any noise might reopen what had just happened.
Catherine's threat wasn't just spite on her way out. It had confirmed in front of 50 witnesses and dozens of phone cameras that the maid everyone had laughed at only an hour ago was something far more dangerous than a punchline. She was a living witness to a night Providence had spent 8 years trying to bury. Hazel stood very still in Benjamin's coat, feeling 50 pairs of eyes shift from Catherine's exit back to her, and understood with a kind of quiet dread that she had just traded one kind of visibility for another. Benjamin led Hazel up to the 3rd floor, into a private room with tall windows overlooking Boston Common. City lights flickered in the distance, calm and indifferent to everything that had just unraveled downstairs. Somewhere below, muffled through the floor, the last of the guests could be heard letting themselves out, their voices lowered, now the party unmistakably over. He closed the door and turned to face her. For the first time all night, the composed, dangerous Mafia boss the whole city feared looked for just a moment, unsure of what to say. He crossed to a side table, poured 2 glasses of water instead of anything stronger, and set one down in front of her without being asked, as if some old instinct in him needed to take care of her hands before it could take care of anything else. Hazel stood near the window, his coat still resting on her shoulders. She opened her mouth, ready to offer some polite excuse to leave. Instead, what came out was something else entirely. "I have the recording from that night," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, her fingers finding the pendant at her throat without her seeming to notice she'd done it. "Both men's voices, the ones arguing outside while I got you inside. I've had it locked in a bank box in Cambridge for 8 years because I thought you were dead." Her voice caught on the last word, and she pressed on before it could break further. "My mother used to say the worst thing you can do with a secret is let it decide who you are. I think I let this one decide who I was for 8 years. I told myself I kept it because it was evidence. Really, I think I kept it because it was the last proof I had that any of it happened, that I wasn't the only one who remembered." Benjamin didn't sit down. He stood very still, watching her the way a man watches weather rolling in. Hazel wasn't handing him a weapon out of trust. She was finally putting down a burden she'd carried alone for 8 years, believing silence was the price of staying safe. Her deepest fear had never been Providence finding her. It was the possibility that revealing what she knew would make her valuable only for what she carried, not for who she was. Choosing to speak now to the one man who had already seen her as more than a maid was the first time in years she let herself be known instead of hidden. Benjamin looked at her the way a man looks at something that could change everything because it could. In an instant, his expression shifted from protector to something closer to recognition. The woman standing in front of him held a piece of leverage that could rewrite the balance of power between 2 families. He caught himself doing the calculation and looked almost ashamed of it, the way a man is ashamed of a reflex he can't quite unlearn. "You could have used that 8 years ago," he said finally. "Sold it, traded it, burned it to make sure no one ever came looking for you. You didn't do any of those things." "I didn't know what it was worth," Hazel said. "I only knew what it cost me to keep it. My mother was sick the last 2 years I had it. I used to sit with her at night and think about telling someone, and then I'd think about what would happen to her if I did, and I'd put it back in the box instead." She looked down at the water glass, not drinking it. "There was no one left to protect after she died. I just never stopped being careful." He crossed the room and set a small business card on the table beside a single key. The card belonged to a dance studio on Boylston Street. "It's not charity," he said. 3 months ago, one of my people turned up a partial match, a woman fitting your description, working catering jobs around the city. I didn't know if it was you, but I bought the place anyway, in case the lead ever closed." The studio, he explained, doubled as a safe house, purchased under a shell company's name because he'd known that the day he finally found the woman in that photograph
would also be the day she became a target.
Hazel looked at the card, then back up at him.
"I don't need to be rescued," she said softly. "I just need to stop being looked at like a joke."
"Then let me protect the person who once refused to watch me die," Benjamin answered, his voice rough.
His phone buzzed on the table. Connor's name lit the screen, followed by 4 words. "They've made their move."
Tension settled over the room instantly. The safe house was ready, but the message made one thing clear. Whoever was coming for Hazel wasn't waiting for anyone to catch their breath. The war had started the moment Catherine screamed her way out the front door. Benjamin's jaw tightened as he read the message twice. Outside, far below on Mount Vernon Street, a car door shut. Ordinary, probably nothing, and still his hand went to the window and pulled the curtain half an inch closed before he caught himself doing it. Hazel watched him, understanding without needing an explanation that whatever came next would not be simple. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. 3 weeks later, sunlight poured through the tall windows of a private studio near Back Bay, while Hazel moved through a new routine, her body no longer hidden beneath a stiff black uniform. The strength that had once been mocked in a marble ballroom now filled the whole room on its own terms. She had started coming in early, before anyone else arrived, just to stand in the empty room and remember why she'd once loved this. Her mother had taught her the first steps of it in the kitchen of their apartment in Jamaica Plain, humming instead of using music, holding Hazel's small hands above her head and telling her that a body that could move like that would never truly be trapped anywhere. Hazel hadn't let herself think about that memory in years. Now it came back to her most mornings unbidden, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd stretch of her warm-up, and instead of pushing it away, she let it stay. The video from that night had spread far beyond Beacon Hill, retitled a dozen times, but the caption that stuck was simple: "The maid who made the Mafia boss end his engagement." Instead of mockery, the comments were full of something else entirely. Strangers calling her a dancer who refused to be made small. Benjamin appeared outside the studio's glass door under a light rain, watching her for a long moment before stepping inside. He didn't say anything at first, just stood near the door, rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat, watching the ease that had come back into the way she moved. "I still remember the dance on Hanover Street," he said quietly. "Would you dance it again? No crowd this time, just me." Hazel slowed to a stop and looked at him, her chest still rising and falling from the last combination, a thin sheen of sweat at her collarbone where the old scar caught the light. When she hesitated, he stepped closer, his voice rougher and more honest than she'd ever heard it. "I don't just want to protect you," he said. "I need you here. You're the only person who ever saw me at my weakest and never once used it against me." She looked at him for a long moment, listening to the rain tick against the windows, to the low hum of the studio's old radiator, to nothing at all for a second, except her own heartbeat slowing back down. Then, for the first time in more years than she could count, Hazel smiled, a real one, and reached out her hand. The instant their fingers touched, Connor's voice broke through the quiet studio over a phone call on speaker. "Boss, they just burned the warehouse in South Boston. Left a note. 4 words. The dancer dies next." The air in the room went still. Hazel's hand tightened around his. Benjamin never took his eyes off her. He ended the call with one motion, his voice low but unshakable. "Then let them come. Anyone who touches her won't be going back to Providence." Outside the city of Boston was bracing for a new kind of storm.
But inside that small sunlit studio, the Mafia boss who ruled an empire had just chosen a woman the world once dismissed as nothing over the fragile piece of everything he had built. The image lingers, here two figures standing close together in a lit room while rain falls steadily outside and the city holds its breath. This story reminds us that the people who hurt us rarely get the last word. We do in what we choose to do next. If you've been counting on someone else to notice your worth, try noticing it yourself first. Call one friend this week just to talk, not because you need anything. If you're recently widowed, keep one small routine that was only ever yours. A Sunday crossword, a walk to the same bakery. Because rebuilding a life doesn't mean replacing every piece of the old one. If you're retired and the days feel long, one afternoon a week teach someone something you know how to do. Being needed again does more for the heart than rest ever will. And if someone in your life still treats you the way that ballroom treated Hazel, you're allowed to simply stop showing up for it. Dignity was never about being loud. It was about staying whole.
What part of Hazel's transformation moved you the most? Tell us in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.